along a 20-mile section of the Wilderness Road in southeast Kentucky in the fall of 1798. 17 travelers vanished. Each disappeared completely, leaving just strewn about possessions and discarded horses that revealed nothing about their whereabouts. The fact that local authorities purposefully buried every document of the subsequent investigation is what makes these disappearances so horrifying, not just the sheer number of them. Before the most unsettling example of organized murder in early American frontier history was uncovered by a county clerk in 1987, the truth about the Hardin family property had been concealed in sealed court documents for more than 200 years. The documents detail a murderous scheme that was so meticulous and expertly passed off as Christian charity that it went undetected for 8 years. Make sure to hit the notification bell and subscribe to our channel before we continue with the tale of the farm that turned into Kentucky's first house of horrors. Tell us in the comments the state you are listening from, as we reveal secrets that powerful families have attempted to keep hidden forever. Our mystery-seeking community loves to hear from you. The simple act of bureaucratic housekeeping in a dusty courthouse basement was the catalyst for the finding that would ultimately reveal the murders committed by the Hardin family, rather than screams in the middle of the night. In 1798, southeast Kentucky was a region torn between civilization and wilderness, with thousands of people drawn westward down perilous mountain roads by the prospect of prosperity. The main route for settlers heading west from Virginia and the Carolinas was the Wilderness Road, which Daniel Boone had cut across the Cumberland Gap 20 years previously. Over 200 miles of this winding, narrow road wound through some of the harshest landscapes in North America, where one mistake could result in death from exposure, untamed animals, or the innumerable human predators that prowled the frontier. Each of the dozens of tiny settlements that had sprang up along this perilous route was a ray of hope for families looking to start over in the Wild West. These communities were important stops along the route where weary travelers could rest, replenish, and learn about the threats ahead. These communities' ability to offer a safe refuge to the steady flow of migrants passing across their borders frequently determined whether they succeeded or failed. The township of Millfield was situated at a pivotal point in the road, where the trail dropped into Beaver Creek's fertile valley from the steep mountains. Everyone knew each other's business, or believed they did, in a place with hardly 300 people. A group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom founded the town in 1794, and their impact was evident in all facets of daily life. All citizens were required to attend Sunday services, and the town government imposed rigid moral standards that prohibited anything from dancing to drinking. Hendrick's General Store, a dilapidated wood structure that doubled as an unofficial courthouse and trading post, was the focal point of the village. The establishment was run with an iron fist and an eye for profit by Jeremiah Hendricks, a rough-and-tumble former militiaman who had fought Indians with Daniel Boone himself. Gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the most recent news from the civilized world outside the mountains were all available in his store. The Cumberland Inn, a 2-story building that epitomized frontier luxury, was located nearby. 5 years prior, the inn's operator, a widow named Martha Crane, had come from Philadelphia with sufficient funds to construct the best lodgings between Lexington and the Virginia border. For 2 bits a night, travelers could find a clean bed, a nice supper, and the kind of polite conversation that brought back memories of the civilization they had left behind. The New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a small log structure that could accommodate everyone during Sunday services, served as the town's spiritual hub. Harvard-educated clergyman Reverend Ephraim Cole, who had left a prosperous Boston pastorate for frontier missions, preached sermons that combined conventional theology with helpful tips for surviving in a harsh environment. Because of his credibility, Millfield was able to draw settlers who might have otherwise continued on without pausing. The Hardins Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children's sons, Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy, were among the most well-liked citizens in Millfield. Claiming to be refugees from violent Indian raids that had destroyed their former home in eastern Virginia, the family had come in the spring of 1791. With Temperance spearheading humanitarian endeavors for impoverished families who came with little more than the clothes on their backs, and Ezekiel acting as a lay preacher who supported Reverend Cole, they immediately became cornerstones of the tiny community. Ezekiel Hardin, was a man whose personality alone was enough to command respect. With the broad shoulders of a lifelong worker and a height well over 6 feet, he exuded a physical presence that caused other men to move aside when he walked into a room. With his eloquent sermons that brought people to tears with their fervent depictions of divine love and terrifying warnings of eternal wrath, his deep voice could effortlessly fill the chapel. He appeared to talk with the authority of someone who had seen heaven and hell firsthand, according to several who heard him preach. In her own right, Temperance Hardin was as impressive. The community's unofficial doctor, she was a little, frail woman with hands that never seemed to stop and hair that had turned prematurely gray. She had an almost miraculous ability to treat everything from broken bones to difficult births, and her knowledge of medicinal herbs was extensive. Her reputation for medical miracles had spread throughout the area, and she was credited with saving the lives of multiple families during emergency situations. Their kids seemed like the epitome of frontier morality. At the age of 26, Caleb, the eldest son, had both his mother's kind disposition and his father's commanding physical presence. While working tirelessly on the family farm, he also found time to assist elderly neighbors with their own crops. When farm labor slowed down in the winter, Josiah, 24, who was smaller but smarter, frequently took on the role of unofficial schoolmaster for the village. Mercy was regarded as one of the county's most attractive young ladies at the age of 22, and both men and women liked her lovely personality. 3 miles south of town, along Beaver Creek, the Hardin farm covered 400 acres of good bottomland. Ezekiel had spent almost all of his money on the land, but it had been a great investment. The creek supplied water for cattle and electricity for a small grist mill that supplied the local area, while the lush soil yielded bountiful grain and tobacco crops. The Hardins appeared to have more material wealth than farming alone could account for, and visitors frequently commented on the farm's remarkable success. Ezekiel had taken great care to ensure his household was secure and comfortable. An almost unheard-of luxury on the frontier, the main home was a 2-story wood building with glass windows and stone chimneys. Silver candlesticks, imported china, carved seats, and books that represented education and refinement were among the furnishings that seemed much too elegant for a modest farming family. 50 horses could be housed in a huge barn and a network of outbuildings, including a blacksmith shop, dairy, smokehouse, and what Ezekiel called the county's largest root cellar. The Hardins' readiness to assist travelers in need was what made them especially valuable to the neighborhood. The frontier was harsh on the unprepared and the lone traveler, and there was hardly a week that went by without someone coming to the farm to ask for help. Several times, Ezekiel had braved inclement weather to help a damaged wagon or hurt horse, frequently allowing stranded people to stay at his property until repairs could be completed. On the frontier, this kind of hospitality was seen as a Christian obligation, but the Hardins went above and above. Temperance was especially well known for her readiness to care for sick or injured travelers, regardless of their financial situation. Numerous lives had been saved by her medical expertise, and her intervention was the only reason that many families were able to continue their journeys. In one of the outbuildings, she kept a fully supplied infirmary, furnished with surgical tools and drugs that most frontier physicians could only hope to have. By 1798, guests sometimes sought out the Hardin farm, especially while making travel plans, demonstrating the family's reputation for friendliness. Parties were frequently led toward Beaver Creek by local guides who assured them that the Hardins would offer reasonable pricing for supplies and secure overnight accommodations. Over the years, Mercy meticulously documented hundreds of visitors in the family's guest book, including families, clergy, merchants, and lone explorers who sought safety at the affluent farm. However, amid the brutal reality of frontier life, where trust might be fatal and death lurked behind every tree, appearances could be more than just deceptive, they could be lethal. When a trader named Samuel Fletcher did not show up in Lexington on the 13th of October 1798, it was the first indication that something was seriously amiss. Fletcher was no typical tourist. A man whose punctuality had made him wealthy. In a world where timing could mean the difference between profit and terrible loss, he was one of the most seasoned and trustworthy merchants on the Wilderness Road. He had traveled the perilous route between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year for 12 years, transporting raw materials east and manufactured goods west. Thomas Greeley, Fletcher's business partner, had known the merchant well enough to be familiar with his habits. Fletcher never took needless chances that could compromise his precious cargo, and he never changed his intended course without informing others. Greeley realized something disastrous had happened when he had not heard anything after 5 days, which was 2 days past Fletcher's scheduled arrival. Following Fletcher's well-known path back from Lexington, Greeley started his search at dawn on October 18. Along the route he asked farmers, merchants, and innkeepers, all of whom attested to Fletcher's timely passage. The path was unobstructed until Greeley arrived to Millfield, when Fletcher appeared to have just disappeared. At midday on the second day of the search, Fletcher's horse was found. The unusual bay mare was discovered grazing freely next to Miller's Creek. She was unharmed and in no trouble, yet she was still wearing her saddle. The animal seemed healthy and well-fed, as though it had been released on purpose rather than in a state of terror. The most perplexing aspect was that the horse's bridle had been taken off and securely fastened on a nearby tree branch, indicating human involvement rather than chance. Still intact were Fletcher's saddlebags, which held his trading items, and a leather purse, filled with about $50 in silver coins, a treasure that symbolized months of perilous labor. The most frequent reason for disappearances on the frontier, simple robbery, was ruled out by the existence of the money. The fact that Fletcher's personal belongings were arranged in a purposeful line away from the road and toward the interior woodlands was even more unsettling. It appeared as though he had been dragged from his horse and had to dump them one by one. Jacob Winters, the local constable, was a man who was well suited to look into these kinds of puzzles. Winters, a veteran sergeant in the Continental Army who had fought alongside Anthony Wayne during the Ohio battles, both the investigative abilities and the bloodthirst for violence needed by frontier law enforcement. The most obvious reasons were frequently the most incorrect, and he had witnessed enough death and deceit to know that Fletcher's absence was anything but typical. Within hours of Greeley's report, Winters had a search party assembled, bringing together 12 of Millfield's best men for what he knew would be a challenging and possibly hazardous investigation. Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding place within 50 miles of town, and Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking abilities matched those of the local Indians, were among the searchers. The search team found something that was incomprehensible. With its ripped cloth entangled in thorns and sporadic drops of what looked like blood, Fletcher's path led unmistakably toward the Hardin farm. According to the signs, the merchant may have been fighting against prisoners who were driving him farther into the woods when he deserted the route, but he was still alive and hurt. But every evidence of Fletcher's passage just vanished at the precise edge of Hardin property. Hours were spent by the searchers searching the trail's end for any clues as to Fletcher's whereabouts. They discovered nothing, no buried blood, no disturbed ground, and no signs of conflict. Samuel Fletcher appeared to have been plucked off the ground and taken into thin air by unseen hands. When faced with such a glaring lack of proof, even the famed tracking prodigy Henrik Johansson conceded defeat. Ezekiel Hardin's response to Winters' questioning concerning the missing merchant was both helpful and oddly prepared. Indeed, on October 13, shortly before sunset, Fletcher had made a stop at the farm to ask for information about a shortcut that would allow him to avoid traveling to Lexington by day. Fletcher had insisted on exploring the route despite Ezekiel's warnings against following unknown paths, particularly with precious commodities and winter weather on the horizon. The merchant had been courteous but rushed, refusing Temperance's offer of a comfortable bed and a hot lunch, preferring to continue while there was still light. Ezekiel claimed that Fletcher had appeared anxious and preoccupied, looking over his shoulder as though he were being pursued, and continuously checking his saddlebags. When questioned about this behavior, Fletcher had said that he had been followed by strange men ever since he left Virginia, but he had brushed off Ezekiel's advice to stay at the farm until a larger group could take him to safety. Fletcher was riding north into the ridgeland when the family last saw him, determined to discover his shortcut in spite of the looming weather and the encroaching darkness. Every member of Ezekiel's family gave the same account of Fletcher's visit. confirming his story in every detail. They recalled his haste, his rejection of their cautions, and even his exact words as he turned down their invitation. Before leaving, Temperance remembered. The merchant had accepted a little vial of her herbal medicine after complaining of stomach issues. Fletcher had declined Caleb's offer to accompany him to the Ridge Trail, saying that his business was too important to wait. Constable Winters should have felt comforted by their constancy. On the contrary, it seemed to him abnormally flawless, like a story that had been meticulously rehearsed and repeated until all the details were ingrained in his mind. In Winters' experience, actual witnesses consistently agreed on important things, but disagreed on minor ones. The Hardin story was too well written, too comprehensive, and too devoid of the minor errors that distinguish authentic testimony. When the constable saw that the farm's layout had changed significantly since his last visit several months prior, his suspicions grew. A brand new smokehouse had been erected close to the main barn. It was remarkably spacious for a family business and had substantial stone walls that appeared to be intended for purposes other than food preservation. A number of outbuildings were surrounded by fresh earth, as though they had just been the site of massive excavations. The oddest of all was that the family's root cellar seemed to have been much expanded, with new timber supports showing around an entrance that now appeared to be big enough to fit a wagon. In response to Winters' inquiry regarding these upgrades, Ezekiel stated that the family had chosen to make an investment in improved facilities for processing and storing their harvests after experiencing an extraordinarily successful harvest. The new smokehouse would enable them to cure meat for both domestic consumption and commercial sale, and the expanded root cellar was required for the larger volume of vegetables and preserved items they intended to market in Lexington. Although the explanations were well reasoned and presented, there was a hint in Ezekiel's demeanor that he was picking his words with extraordinary care. Worst of all, the constable couldn't help but notice the anxious energy that pervaded the family's renowned hospitality, which made their customary warmth seem forced during Winters' visit. As she poured coffee, Temperance's hands trembled a little, and Mercy continued to look at her father as though she was asking for his approval of everything she said. Even the typically self-assured and gregarious young guys, Caleb and Josiah, appeared reserved and wary in ways that suggested they were concealing something important. But there wasn't much that Constable Winters could do legally in the absence of hard proof of misconduct. Fletcher's name was added to the mounting list of frontier deaths that symbolized the cost of westward migration, and his case was formally documented as a suspected highway robbery or Indian attack. After the merchant's horse was auctioned off to pay off his unpaid bills, Samuel Fletcher vanished from the world within a month, leaving only the recollections of his acquaintances. However, Fletcher's disappearance would turn out to be only the start of a pattern that would haunt the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, turning a thriving agricultural town into a place where parents kept their kids close to home after dark and travelers murmured warnings. The awful regularity of the disappearances over the winter of 1798 and the spring of 1799 defied every reasonable explanation. There was a zone of fear that extended from Millfield for almost 20 miles in all directions, with another traveler disappearing without explanation along the same section of road every 2 to 3 weeks. The victims' ages, incomes, and modes of transportation ranged greatly. Small family groupings, lone traders like Fletcher, and even heavily armed groups traveling together for protection. Their total disappearance and the fact that each had been spotted approaching or asking for directions to the Hardin farm before disappearing into the woods were what bound them together. In November, while traveling from Richmond to Louisville to open a medical practice, Dr. Marcus Cromwell vanished. For more than $300, the 43-year-old doctor carried his life's work in the form of medical equipment, books, and supplies, an investment that reflected years of planning and saving. 3 miles from the Hardin farm, close to Devil's Fork, his wagon had been discovered overturned, its goods strewn about but seemingly undisturbed. Local officials believed that Cromwell had been flung from his seat in an accident, wandered in confusion into the forest, and eventually perished from exposure. Until searchers found that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the debris, the scenario made sense. The leather satchel held excellent surgical tools, such as an amputation kit and bone saw, which would be quite helpful to anyone trying to perform frontier medicine. Ordinary robbers would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that were still lying about the crash scene, and no wild animal would have taken such stuff. During one of the worst blizzards in recent memory, the Henley family disappeared in December. Just half a mile from the Hardin property, Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 small children had been seeking refuge when their wagon got stuck in a snowdrift. Even though it was a short way, the family had never arrived at his home, according to Ezekiel's later testimony, most likely becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. When the weather cleared, there were thorough searches, but their corpses were never located. The fact that their wagon was found a week after the storm was what made the Henley case so unsettling. After being removed from the snowdrift and left by the side of the road, the car had been cleared of snow and reportedly given a thorough search. The family's tools and food supplies were still there, but their clothes and personal items were gone. Most perplexing of all, traces found around the wagon indicated that several individuals had collaborated to get it out of the drift, which would have taken a lot of time and effort in hazardous conditions. Reverend Nathan Cross, a traveling preacher who was delivering money for a new church in Frankfort, vanished in January. Cross was well known in the area for both his fearless journeys through the most hazardous parts of the frontier and his stirring preaching. After 15 years of preaching, the 50-year-old priest had withstood Indian invasions, bandits, and innumerable natural disasters. So his disappearance was especially shocking to communities that had grown to believe he was unbreakable. 3 days after his disappearance, Cross's horse was discovered, still toting saddlebags filled with about $200 in gifts from the church. Although robbery was ruled out as a motive by the existence of the money, it was troubling to consider what kind of threat could have overpowered such a skilled and smart man. Eventually, local officials came to the conclusion that Cross had died somewhere in the wide forest that encircled the forest road after suffering a heart attack or stroke while traveling and falling from his horse. Every disappearance followed the same unexplained pattern, traces that inexorably led to Hardin property before disappearing entirely, abandoned horses discovered grazing loose or tied to trees, and personal possessions strewn about that suggested abrupt violence or struggle. However, the Hardin family offered believable justifications that were impossible to refute when questioned by officials who were growing more suspicious. Yes, they had seen a few of the travelers, but generally from a distance and only for a short time. Despite the family's worried advice, each victim decided to go with their voyage, despite being warned about a number of hazards, including inclement weather, challenging terrain, and rumors of bandit activity. In other instances, visitors who were intent on sticking to their timetables at all costs graciously turned down the Hardins' offers of food, lodging, or escort services. With every new disappearance, Constable Winters was caught in an unworkable scenario that became increasingly irritating. He was the only one who doubted the Hardins' reputation for Christian goodness and kindness, making them one of the most revered families in the county. Even well-educated preachers like Reverend Cole were impressed by Ezekiel's passionate delivery and scriptural understanding, which continued to attract audiences from nearby townships. During the previous summer's fever outbreak, Temperance's medical expertise had saved dozens of lives, and among appreciative families, she was practically a saint. Without unquestionable evidence, accusing such community leaders would be social rejection and career death. Winters had witnessed the fate of police officers who made unprovable accusations. They ended up without friends, without a job, and occasionally even charged themselves. Attacking the wrong family may ruin a man's life more effectively than any legal action, since the frontier was based on a complicated web of interpersonal relationships and reciprocal duties. Furthermore, although the family's justifications were always practical, they were completely plausible in the context of frontier life. Bandits, aggressive Indians, harsh weather, and the innumerable natural perils that frequently took life made the wilderness road really perilous. Every year, dozens of tourists vanished under circumstances that were far less enigmatic than those involving the Hardin property. Because there were too many people too close together, and they were all last seen in the same general area, this cluster of vanishings was unique for statistical reasons. However, in a world where evidence was crucial, numbers were meaningless, and anytime investigators came near the Hardin property, the evidence seemed to vanish like morning mist. The family even offered volunteers for search parties, who scoured the nearby forest for traces of the missing passengers, welcomed examinations of their buildings and grounds, and responded to inquiries in an apparently transparent manner. To the increasingly irritated constable, their assistance was so eager and comprehensive that it almost amounted to ridicule. 9-year-old Timothy Voren, whose family resided on a small farmhouse 2 miles east of the Hardin farm, was the first to cause a break in the family's meticulously preserved facade. Timothy was well known in the neighborhood for being a creative youngster who enjoyed exploring the woods around his family's home. He would frequently bring home lengthy tales about the animals and natural beauties he had seen on his explorations. Young Timothy came to Constable Winters in March 1799 with a story that at first glance appeared to be the result of yet another child's imagination. According to the youngster, he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Hardin farm when he was exploring the woods close to Beaver Creek. However, these were not the screams that resulted from mishaps, disputes, or even childbirth. They were the prolonged, frantic screams of a person in a state of deathly fear, rising and falling in rhythms that alluded to both mental and physical suffering. Timothy claimed to have heard such noises at least 5 times during the winter, all of which had occurred during the darkest hours of the night, when good people ought to be sleeping. For what seemed like hours, the screaming would go on, occasionally accompanied by other noises the child was unable to recognize, such as the creak of ropes or pulleys, repetitive pounding, and sometimes what sounded like several people chanting simultaneously. Every time the noises ceased suddenly, there was a total silence that made Timothy question whether he had dreamed the whole thing. The boy's parents acknowledged hearing weird noises themselves when Winters questioned them, but they had written them off as typical frontier occurrences, such as animal calls that were muffled by distance and wind, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the woods. The Hardins, after all, were devout Christians who had never raised suspicion. Why would someone from such a reputable household be screaming in the middle of the night? Except for a single detail that caused Constable Winters to pause, Timothy's story may have been written off as childish fantasy or misconstrued natural sounds. When asked to name the days he heard the screams, the kid was able to do so with accuracy, and each date matched the predicted time of a traveler's disappearance exactly. The association was too persistent to be explained by chance, and too exact to be coincidental. With the painstaking patience of a man who knew that allegations against such well-known persons would require absolutely unassailable proof, Constable Winters started to construct a case against the Hardin family using Timothy Voren's unsettling testimony. In order to keep his concerns from being confirmed and to keep the Hardins unaware of his investigation, he began by discreetly interviewing other neighbors who resided within hearing distance of the farm. These covert investigations revealed a troubling trend of minor discrepancies and unexplained occurrences that had been disregarded, discounted, or explained away by those who placed greater faith in the family's reputation than in their own observations. Even if each piece of evidence was insignificant on its own, taken as a whole, they created a picture that chilled Winters to the bone. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm was closest to the Hardin property, recounted a few nights when she had witnessed strange activity at their homestead. The sounds of heavy construction and digging that seemed to go on until dawn, and lanterns moving between buildings at times when decent people should be sleeping. The woman had given Temperance Hardin a plausible explanation when she had brought up these observations to her after church services. The family was renovating their root cellar and other storage facilities, and they would rather work on these projects at night than waste valuable daylight that could be used to tend to crops. Sarah was happy with the explanation at the time, but looking back, she saw that the midnight construction had gone on for months, longer than any sane building project would have needed. Furthermore, she had never seen the enormous quantities of earth that should have been created by such extensive excavating. Sarah acknowledged that the sounds had frequently been accompanied by what appeared to be muffled voices, and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress when Winters pressed her for further information. Even more alarming discoveries were made by old Henrik Johansson, whose farm was adjacent to the Hardin property to the north. Along their shared fence line, the Swedish immigrant, whose hunting and tracking prowess was legendary throughout the county, had found animal bones scattered about. These bones weren't the typical remains of butchered livestock, but rather bones that had been cracked, gnawed, and processed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than routine farming activities. Skulls and large bones from pigs, horses, and cattle were among the bones, but there were also tiny pieces that Johansen, who knew a lot about the local fauna, was unable to identify. Most unsettlingly, some of the bones had saw marks that indicated systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity, while others had evidence of being purposefully smashed with tools. When Johansen had asked Ezekiel about the unexplained bone deposits, the patriarch had given a tenable but in some ways unsatisfying explanation. He said that the family had had to scatter the remains of several diseased livestock carcasses throughout the woods because wild animals had been especially problematic that winter. The bone fragments were only the product of these discarded carcasses being broken down over time by scavengers and weather. However, Johansen's keen observation had picked up on details that ran counter to this naive justification. The bones were not the product of natural decay because they were too clean, too thoroughly processed, and too widely dispersed. Furthermore, a large number of the fragments displayed signs of having been cooked or otherwise heated, indicating intentional processing as opposed to the straightforward disposal of sick animals. The Hardin family's conduct and demeanor have changed dramatically over the past year, according to several neighbors, which is particularly telling. Once lively and gregarious, the kids had turned inward and reclusive, shunning social events and only talking when someone personally approached them. Once well-liked by their peers, Caleb and Josiah now appeared anxious and worried in public, as though they were always thinking about personal matters. The change in Mercy Hardin was especially noticeable. Her face carried a haunting expression that made others uneasy, and the young woman who had once been regarded as one of the most attractive and lively females in the country suddenly looked haggard and prematurely aged. She had completely ceased going to social events, and when she did show up in public, she appeared to avoid interaction with people as though she were terrified of disclosing some horrible secret. Over the past few months, even Ezekiel's sermons had become more somber, fixating on themes of divine judgment, the punishment of sinners, and the need to eradicate evil from the world. His sermons, which had previously highlighted God's mercy and love, now nearly solely spoke of God's wrath and retribution. Concern over the increasingly violent images in his biblical readings had been discreetly voiced by a number of churchgoers. Additionally, Constable Winters found troubling omissions from the Hardin family's history that cast doubt on their real identity and place of origin. No one had been able to authenticate their prior residency or the precise attacks that had allegedly pushed them westward, despite their claims to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia. There were no records of any Hardin family being impacted by Indian violence during the time period they stated, according to Winters' inquiry to Virginia authorities. Furthermore, it appeared as though the Hardins had appeared out of thin air in the spring of 1791, and their presence in Kentucky was the first recorded instance of their existence. They had no business records from their former life, no letters from family, and no personal belongings that before their arrival in Millfield. They had arrived in Kentucky with considerable financial resources and an amazing collection of household items, which was remarkable for a family that claimed to have lost everything to Indian raids. In April 1799, a traveling peddler called Isaac Brewster arrived in Millfield with information that turned suspicion into near certainty, giving the constable's investigation an unanticipated and alarming boost. Brewster was widely known across the frontier, a guy whose job required him to travel between communities all the time and who had an encyclopedic understanding of the people and events of the area. In eastern Tennessee, where he had spent the previous winter, Brewster had heard unsettling tales of a string of disappearances that had afflicted the Holston River Valley from 1789 to 1791. Locals reported that at least 15 people had disappeared down a lonely road close to a successful farm run by the Harper family, which included Zechariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 grown children. It was impossible for the Tennessee disappearances and the ongoing Kentucky cases to be coincidence, given how strikingly alike they were. The pattern always the same. Tourists would be spotted making their way to the Harper property and then just go, leaving behind nothing but strewn about possessions and stray horses. Due to the same dearth of tangible evidence that was impeding Winter's current inquiry, local officials had suspected the family but had never been able to establish their involvement. Brewster's descriptions of the Harper family themselves were much more terrifying. Prudence was revered throughout the area for her extraordinary healing skills, and Zachariah was a lay preacher renowned for his stirring sermons and altruistic deeds. Before their abrupt entrance, they had no verified history and had come to the valley claiming to be refugees from Indian raids. The family had established a reputation as the backbone of their community and was well known for their friendliness to tourists. Winters's blood turned to icy water as Brewster detailed the Harper family's physical attributes. Zachariah Harper had been a tall, commanding guy with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair. Small and fragile, Prudence had deft hands and a vast knowledge of therapeutic herbs. Their offspring could have been the same individuals because they closely matched Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Hardin's ages and descriptions. The Harpers' departure in the spring of 1791, when suspicion was starting to center on their land, was the most incriminating of all. They had left their farm and disappeared without a trace. The homestead was abandoned by the neighbors, who saw evidence of hurried departure and intentional devastation. The entire farm displayed signs of a methodical removal of everything that would reveal the family's true identities or activities, including half-burned buildings and wells filled with rocks and trash. Upon obtaining warrants to explore the abandoned Harper property, Tennessee authorities found revelations that continue to plague the detectives involved. The corpses of humans and animals were interred in scores of small graves tucked away in the woods around the estate. Several of the missing passengers' personal belongings were found among the human remains, providing indisputable proof that the Harper family had committed several murders. By that time, however, the murderers had entirely disappeared, leaving only their crimes and the mystery surrounding their real identity. The Harper family had been presumed to have either escaped to areas outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law or perished in the wilderness after a 6-month manhunt had failed to find any evidence of them. Brewster's insights had startling and scary ramifications. The Hardin family, if his story was true, were not just local criminals who had committed a few opportunistic killings. They were skilled serial killers who had honed their techniques over years of practice, traveling from one area to another when suspicion became too great and leaving a trail of bodies that spanned several states. Even worse, compared to their earlier operations in Tennessee, their current operation in Kentucky seemed to be far more advanced and effective. They had improved their techniques for getting rid of evidence, learned from their failures, and devised a more believable cover identity, which had enabled them to go 8 years without being discovered. One of the most widespread killing sprees in American criminal history, Kentucky's death toll probably significantly outnumbered Tennessee's. Constable Winters felt the weight of Isaac Brewster's testimony pressing down on him like a physical burden, but he was aware that no matter how strong the evidence was, it would not be enough to have the Hardin family convicted in a court of law. Judges had to get unquestionable physical proof before approving arrests that may endanger innocent lives and upend established communities, and frontier justice was a methodical process. The constable required evidence that could not be explained away or written off as coincidence, evidence that would withstand the examination of doubtful juries and critical lawyers. The last person he would have thought to provide him the breakthrough he sorely needed was Mercy Hardin herself, the 2-year-old woman whose face was smeared with tears and whose hands trembled with barely controlled dread, materialized from the darkness at Winter's cabin on the night of May 22, 1799, like a ghost. Over the course of the following 3 hours, she would reveal to him the complete horror of what had been taking on at the Hardin farm and offer the proof required to apprehend the most infamous family of murderers in Kentucky. Mercy's heartbreaking admission revealed that her family had been killing tourists on a regular basis for more than 8 years, starting a few months after they arrived in Kentucky. Her testimony was extremely disturbing, though not only because of the extent of their crimes, but also because of the deliberate, almost ritualistic manner in which they had planned and carried out the killings. Mercy explained that the killing operation was much more complex than Winters had thought it could be. Ezekiel, her father, had persuaded the family that by eradicating what he referred to as unworthy souls from the border highways, they were doing God's will. The killings were well-planned executions that fulfilled the family's increasingly complex material requirements, as well as what Ezekiel felt was divine justice, rather than being haphazard acts of violence motivated by opportunity or greed. The process started with what the family referred to as evaluation. Ezekiel would have seemingly innocent conversations with promising targets who came to the farm, such as travelers carrying valuable goods, large sums of money, or skills that the family desired, in order to gauge their moral character. Presenting himself as a worried Christian neighbor concerned about their safety, he would inquire about their families, their religious beliefs, their business activities, and the reasons behind their travels. The wealthy were automatically guilty of materialism and greed. Educated people were condemned for their pride and intellectual arrogance, and families with small children were accused of recklessly putting innocent lives in danger. Ezekiel would use these discussions to decide whether each traveler deserved what he called judgment. Even missionaries and clergy could be condemned as heretics deserving of death for doctrinal mistakes or feigned devotion. The family would work as precisely as a military operation once Ezekiel had delivered his secret conclusion, citing concerns for their safety on hazardous roads, or offering help with wagon or equipment maintenance. They would extend an invitation to the doomed passengers to spend the night. Such invites were nearly impossible to decline due to the family's reputation for generosity, particularly in inclement weather or when guests were truly in need of assistance. In the main house, the destined guests would be greeted with what seemed to be authentic frontier hospitality. While the children entertained guests with music, conversation, and demonstrations of their knowledge and sophistication, Temperance would create elaborate meals that showcased her culinary prowess. Ezekiel, whose strong voice and biblical knowledge captivated even doubtful guests, would lead family prayers as the evening came to a close. However, each meal ended with a meticulously crafted concoction of herbs that Temperance had honed over years of trial and error. When combined with strong coffee or whiskey, the chemical cocktail was almost undetectable and produced symptoms that resembled natural fatigue following a long day of travel. The victims would progressively grow sleepy and confused, agreeing to the family's recommendation that they go to bed early in order to regain their energy for the travel the following day. Upon awakening, the drugged passengers would discover themselves confined and defenseless in the farm's subterranean chambers, an intricate system of rooms and tunnels that had been dug out much deeper than would be necessary for a typical root cellar. Mercy described the underground structure as being about 200 yards from the main home, with several levels connected by wooden ladders and stone steps. The largest room functioned as what Ezekiel referred to as his courtroom, a hideous mockery of court proceedings furnished with iron shackles embedded in the stone walls, a makeshift judge's bench carved out of limestone, and religious symbols that had been twisted into tools of terror. In this situation, Ezekiel would oversee official trials that decided each prisoner's ultimate destiny, presenting proof of their alleged transgressions and rendering decisions that were decided upon before the trial even started. The trials, however, were more than just cruel theater. In the twisted psyche of the family, they had a useful function. Ezekiel had established a religious system that led his family to carry out atrocities while preserving their self-perception as devout Christians by portraying the killings as acts of divine justice rather than straightforward crimes. Every murder turned into a religious obligation, and every victim was sacrificed in an effort to rid the frontier of unworthy souls. In his underground tribunal, Ezekiel imposed different punishments based on his evaluation of the crimes of each victim and the needs of the family at the time. Before being put to death, some inmates were kept alive for weeks or even months and made to use their talents for the benefit of their families. Temperance had been forced to learn sophisticated surgical methods from Dr. Cromwell, the doctor who had vanished in November prior to his passing. Ezekiel's reputation as a biblical scholar was enhanced by the sermons he later gave, which Reverend Cross had been compelled to prepare. Others were put to death right away, typically using techniques that Ezekiel said were approved by the Bible. The punishment for pride or blasphemy was drowning in the underground cisterns, while thieves and bandits were hanged. Ezekiel reserved the most elaborate executions for those he deemed to be the most wicked, which included government officials, wealthy merchants, and anyone who had expressed doubt about frontier religion. The horror in Kentucky becomes worse just when we think we've seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who liked dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs next. In horrifying detail, Mercy's testimony exposed the family's systemic criminal behavior. In the murders and the complex cover-up that ensued, each member had been given a specific duty. As the backbone of the operation, Caleb and Josiah were in charge of capturing victims, keeping the underground complex in good condition, and disposing of dead via a network of limestone caverns that connected to the deepest areas of the chambers that had been constructed. They were perfect for the physical demands of transporting big tons of stone and earth as well as unconscious inmates because of their size and strength. Mercy had been compelled to act as the family's record keeper, keeping thorough ledgers that listed each victim's name, belongings, and disposal method. Her meticulous handwriting filled dozens of notebooks with data that resembled a merchant's inventory, except that the transactions were murders and the commodities were human lives. Along with information about the victim's last words and actions while incarcerated, each record contained the victim's name, age, appearance, estimated fortune, and personal belongings. Perhaps the most important factor in the operation's success was Temperance. She was the family's medical specialist, producing the medications that rendered victims comatose, keeping inmates alive when their abilities were needed, and making sure that executions went smoothly so as not to produce evidence. After years of practicing medicine on the frontier, her understanding of anatomy had been corrupted into proficiency in murder and torture. The most horrifying of all was that Temperance had created treatments for inmates who refused to cooperate or tried to break out. These penalties, which blended her medical expertise with psychological torment, were intended to shatter the will without killing the victim. Inmates would endure measured doses of pain and horror until they were totally obedient if they did not comply with the family's demands. More than just meticulous preparation had been necessary for the family to successfully evade scrutiny. It necessitated a complex deception and disposal scheme that wiped out any trace of their crimes. Instead of being buried on the actual farm property, the bodies were moved to distant limestone caves located miles away from the homestead via the cave system. Due to their remote location from the farm, these natural chambers offered ideal conditions for decomposition and made detection all but impossible. Personal items were arranged with the effectiveness of seasoned business people. Money, jewels, expensive weaponry, and tools were among the valuables that were either saved by the family or sold in far-off marketplaces where they could not be linked to missing people. Along highways across the area, less value items were deliberately strewn about to create false trails that implied Indian attacks or robberies. Even the victim's clothing was handled methodically. Unique pieces were destroyed to avoid identification, but functional clothes was retained for the family's use. The horses were especially difficult to identify because they were both valued and well known to those who knew the victims. The family had made contacts with dishonest horse dealers in far-off countries who didn't inquire about the animal's provenance. The Hardens further complicated inquiries by creating more false trails by selling the horses distant from the location where their owners had vanished. The way they used their charity endeavors to dispel suspicion, however, was arguably the most clever part of their deceit. Every deed of generosity, every medical intervention by Temperance, and every lecture by Ezekiel had two functions. They actually benefited the community, while also establishing a reputation that rendered the family all but impervious. Who would think that organized murder could be committed by those who rescued lives during epidemics? Even backup plans for various kinds of investigations had been created by the family. They would momentarily stop killing while increasing their humanitarian endeavors to boost their reputation if authorities became overly suspicious. Similar to how they had left Tennessee years before, they had mapped out a number of escape routes that would enable them to swiftly leave the farm if they were discovered. Mercy stated that the family had been preparing to greatly increase their business in order to establish a network of killing locations that would enable them to act with even more impunity They had located a number of other isolated properties along the Wilderness Road where comparable trials might be held. The ultimate objective was to create what Ezekiel referred to as courts of divine justice across the border, eradicating unworthy travelers on a scale that would transform the moral fabric of the entire area. Mercy's fear for her own life, however, was what ultimately compelled her to confess, rather than a sudden conscience or moral awakening. The peddler who had been asking questions about the disappearances in Tennessee, Isaac Brewster, a number of neighbors who had asked too many questions, and even Constable Winters himself were now on that list, she disclosed, because Ezekiel had become more and more paranoid about possible discovery and had started to see anyone who might be a threat as worthy of judgment. Even more horrifying, Mercy revealed that another victim was being detained in the subterranean rooms at the moment, William Patterson, a traveling surveyor who had been apprehended 3 days prior and was to stand trial the next evening. However, Patterson was not the only prisoner held by the family. They were also secretly harboring 2 other prisoners, an old man known as Luther Grimby, a wandering preacher who had vanished the month before, and a young woman called Rebecca Foster, who had been missing for more than a week. The discovery that several victims were being detained at the same time demonstrated the family's extreme escalation of their actions and their growing confidence in their strategies. An intricate routine that regarded human life as raw material for the family's perverse ends led to the detention, sorting, and execution of inmates, turning what had started out as opportunistic killings of lone travelers into something that approached an industrial murdering operation. Winters understood that there was no more time for a thorough investigation and legal proceedings. If Mercy was right, if nothing was done right away, innocent people would be killed in a matter of hours. However, he was also aware of how extremely risky it would be to approach the Hardin family directly. They had spent years honing their fortified position for just such a scenario, and they were armed, ready for resistance and inaction. Knowing that every decision he made may have fatal repercussions, Constable Winters had to make the most difficult decision of his law enforcement career. He might try to apprehend the Hardin family by himself, endangering not only his own life, but also possibly warning them to flee before their present victims might be saved. He could also travel to Lexington for reinforcements, which would likely result in the execution of Patterson, Foster, and Grimby. This would allow the Hardins to destroy the evidence and escape to another area where they could continue their murderous rampage. Winters' realization that he wouldn't have to act alone made the decision easier. When asked for help, Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had been developing for months, volunteered right away. The immigrant was a crucial ally for what would effectively be a combat operation because of his military background in the Swedish army and his familiarity with the local environment. Feeling guilty for not exposing the Harper family's atrocities in Tennessee years prior, Isaac Brewster also offered his help. The peddler's familiarity with frontier violence and his understanding of the family's past tactics would be essential in predicting how they would react to an attack. The hurriedly put-together rescue party was completed by 2 more men from town, Daniel Crawford, a veteran of Indian fighting, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter. The strategy they came up with was incredibly risky yet inevitably straightforward. On May 23, the group would approach the Hardin farm after midnight, taking advantage of the family's defensive advantages by being unexpected and using darkness. Capturing the murderers was a secondary goal. Saving the incarcerated victims was their top priority. The rescuers were willing to use whatever force was required to stop the Hardins from escaping if they could not be saved. Mercy supplied vital information regarding the layout of the farm and the probable defensive positions of the family. There were only 2 entrances to the underground complex, a hidden emergency escape that emerged in the woods about a quarter-mile from the main home, and the main entrance through the expanded root cellar. Ezekiel had trained his boys in defensive techniques that would deter invaders long enough for the family to flee down the network of caves, and the family stored weapons stockpiled at both places. The rescuers had to travel about a mile of open terrain on their way to the farm, which would have left them totally vulnerable if they were discovered. Johansson's ability to track was crucial in locating a path that maximized concealment by utilizing forest lines and creek beds. The party moved in the quiet of seasoned hunters, each man knowing that if they were discovered, they and the inmates they were attempting to rescue would probably perish. Their greatest fears were surpassed by what they found when they arrived at the Hardin farm, which also proved that Mercy's testimony had, in fact, downplayed the severity of her family's crimes. There was obvious signs of recent excavation work done on the farm, substantially more than would be needed for a typical agricultural operation. The yard was littered with piles of stone and dirt, and the stench of rot and lime permeated the air like a tangible presence. From the outside, the main house looked normal, with smoke rising from the chimneys and warm light glowing in the windows. But as the rescuers got closer, they heard sounds that made their blood chill. Muffled voices from underground, sporadic screams that were soon put out, and the steady clatter of metal hitting stone that indicated that construction was still taking place in the subterranean chambers. At precisely 2 a.m, the rescue effort got underway. When the invaders thought the family would be the most susceptible to a surprise attack and the least vigilant. Stokes and Crawford positioned themselves to block the emergency escape, while Winters and Johansson moved toward the main entrance of the underground complex. Brewster stayed behind with the horses, prepared to cover fire in case something went wrong. The entrance to the root cellar turned out to be far more ornate than Mercy had mentioned. From the outside, it looked like a straightforward storage building, but it was actually a highly advanced fortification with numerous defensive positions and unobstructed fire fields. In order to create killing zones that would enable a small number of defenders to repel a much larger attacking force, the Hardins had spent years planning for just such an onslaught. The biggest advantage of the raiders, however, was total surprise. After years of successful operations, the family had become complacent and never imagined that local law enforcement might breach their well-maintained cover. Ezekiel and his sons were utterly unprepared for resistance when Winters and Johansson entered the underground complex. Instead, they were preoccupied with the gory task of getting their current victims ready for execution. Both easier and more horrific than the raiders had expected, the inmates were rescued. They discovered William Patterson confined in a stone cell that was just big enough for a man to stand up straight. He was still alive and lucid despite being weak after going days without eating enough. Temperance's treatments to break Rebecca Foster's resistance were evident in her worsening health. After weeks of imprisonment and psychological abuse, Luther Grimby was hardly conscious. However, the underground facility was not only occupied by the inmates. The raiders found evidence of the family's atrocities that was beyond human comprehension as they dug deeper into the underground labyrinth. The charnel house with human remains from almost 10 years of methodical murder was found in the limestone chambers. Numerous rooms were filled with bones, pieces of clothes, and personal belongings, forming an archaeological record of brutality that would take weeks to thoroughly classify. The physical evidence was so extensive and detailed that it was astounding. Along with the human remains, the raiders discovered the meticulous documents Mercy had described, meticulously arranged like a merchant's ledger and written in her immaculate handwriting. The names, descriptions, and last belongings of 67 victims over an 8-year period were recorded in the journals. This was significantly more than the investigation had discovered and represented one of the largest killing sprees in American criminal history. Perhaps the most damning evidence, however, was found in what Ezekiel had referred to as his courtroom. The underground compartment held a number of personal trophies taken from victims, in addition to the improvised judge's bench and religious symbols Mercy had described. The full scope of the family's sick satisfaction in their murders was exposed by the Museum of Murder created by the exhibition of weapons, jewelry, scalps, and other keepsakes, like war honors. Ezekiel and his sons tried to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims, which led to the quick but violent capture of the Hardin family. Gunfire reverberated through the stone rooms as the patriarch, unsurprised by his discovery, began a meandering lecture about divine judgment and the sanctity of his purpose. Caleb and Josiah used their deep understanding of the tunnel system to launch attacks from hidden places, fighting with the ferocity of soldiers who knew they would die if captured. The raiders had to go cautiously through tunnels that the defenders had set up as killing zones, while the combat raged through several chambers for almost an hour. Temperance's effort to erase evidence by burning the building and its contents while locked in the main home above was the final straw. The major entrance to the underground complex may collapse, trapping everyone below as the flames quickly spread through the dry timber construction. When the remaining Hardens were forced to choose between burning alive and giving up, they eventually put down their guns. Mercy was the only one who voluntarily gave up, as her confession had already condemned her family and sealed their doom. She appeared to be resigned to whatever judgment lay ahead when she was discovered in her chamber, kneeling in prayer. Her fear that her father's paranoia would eventually brand her for execution along with the family's other imagined enemies had driven her to cooperate with the investigation rather than a moral awakening. Following the Harden family's imprisonment, towns in Kentucky and the larger frontier area were forced to face the horrifying truth that one of their most esteemed families had been killing tourists on a regular basis for almost 10 years. The extent of the crimes was difficult for local officials to comprehend because, to the massive and unsettling evidence retrieved from the underground facility, even the raiders' worst fears were exceeded by the information uncovered by the post-raid investigation. Nearly 2 miles of natural limestone caverns that the Harden family had altered for their deadly intentions made up the cave system beneath the farm, which was significantly larger than anyone had anticipated. Dozens of inmates might be housed in the underground complex that was created by the excavation and reinforcement of several chambers. The physical evidence found in these chambers depicted a pattern of systematic murder that may have extended beyond the family's 8 years in Kentucky to include decades of such murders in other areas. Searchers discovered human remains and personal belongings that indicated the actual number of killings was much higher than the 67 deaths listed in Mercy's meticulous records. The finding of children's toys and clothing among the retrieved evidence was especially unsettling because it showed that entire families, not just lone tourists, had been slain. It was discovered that the Henley family, who had vanished during the December blizzard, had been detained in the subterranean complex for more than a week prior to their execution. After the deaths of their parents, their 6- and 8-year-old children had been kept alive for a few days before being murdered and their bodies dumped in the deepest caverns. Observers from all across Kentucky and the neighboring territories came to watch the Harden family trial, which started in late June 1799 and continued for over a month. Families of the victims, interested bystanders, and legal professionals who understood that this case was unique in American criminal history filled the Lexington courthouse every day. The Honorable Samuel Whitmore, the presiding judge, ordered parts of the testimony hidden from public access because the information was so overwhelming and unsettling. Even seasoned court observers were taken aback by Ezekiel Harden's actions during the trial. Instead of expressing regret for his crimes or trying to downplay the role of his family, he took advantage of his testimony to give lengthy sermons about the justice of God and the morality of his mission. As part of a holy battle against evil and corruption on the frontier, he asserted that God had approved of each murder. Ezekiel's perverted theology held that he and his family had been selected as divine judges and entrusted with destroying unworthy souls that threatened the moral order of Christian society. The victims' money and possessions were a just reward for their holy labor, not robbery. The ornate underground building served as a courtroom where God's justice was administered in accordance with biblical principles rather than as a prison. Despite the overwhelming evidence, his wife and sons said they were innocent, claiming that Ezekiel's religious fervor and threats of violence had forced them to participate. Caleb and Josiah testified that their father had persuaded them that they were engaged in a holy battle against satanic agents who posed a threat to their community, while Temperance said that her medical expertise had been utilized against her will to keep prisoners alive. Numerous pieces of evidence refuted these allegations, demonstrating that every member of the family had joyfully and voluntarily taken part in the killings. Each member of the family had contributed to recording their crimes, as evidenced by the notations and various handwritings found in Mercy's thorough records. Trophies seized from victims were among the personal belongings discovered in their rooms, indicating that the killings brought them psychological fulfillment rather than just financial gain. Mercy Harden was the only one to show sincere regret for her involvement in the killings, but her evidence showed that fear, not moral awakening, had been the main reason for her cooperation with the police. She helped identify several of the victims whose bones had been discovered in the cave system and gave important information about the family's tactics. Prosecutors showed her some clemency because she was willing to testify against her family members, but she would still be severely punished for her involvement in the crimes. Judge Whitmore's prompt and resolute sentences demonstrated the gravity of the offenses as well as the community's desire for justice. Caleb, Josiah Hardin, Temperance, and Ezekiel were all given hanging sentences, and their execution was set for the 15th of August, 1799. The date was specifically picked since it was precisely 1 year since the disappearance of Samuel Fletcher opened the inquiry into the family's misdeeds and resulted in their capture. Because Mercy Hardin was young when many of the crimes were committed and cooperated with the authorities, she was spared from execution and given a life sentence. She would become one of the longest-serving inmates in the history of the Kentucky State Penitentiary, spending the last 43 years of her life there. With more than 4,000 people came from all over the area to see the end of the most infamous family of murderers on the frontier. The executions attracted the largest crowd in Kentucky's history up to that moment. Spectators who had traveled great distances to witness justice being delivered were provided food and beverages by vendors, giving the gathering a carnival-like feel. Using his last words to deliver a meandering sermon in which he condemned the society for rejecting his vision of divine justice, Ezekiel continued to be a religious fanatic till the very end. He foretold that the exact sinners his family had labored to eradicate would take over the frontier, and that God would punish Kentucky for putting his chosen slaves to death. One of the darkest periods in early American criminal history came to an end with the silent deaths of his wife and sons. Following the killings, the Hardin farm was completely destroyed by fire, reducing all of the buildings to ashes and debris in a ceremony that became ritualistic for the traumatized community. Tons of rock and explosives were used to seal the underground rooms, resulting in a tomb that would allow the family's victims to finally rest in peace. The land was deemed cursed by the local authorities, who also prohibited any further building on the property. However, the Hardin family's crimes had a lasting legacy that went well beyond their own passing, setting significant precedents in frontier justice and radically altering how local communities perceived the proper ratio between protection and hospitality. The case created procedures for looking into missing people that would affect law enforcement procedures for decades and resulted in new legislation requiring background checks for land acquisitions. More significantly, the Hardin case served as a terrifying cautionary tale about the perils of placing unquestioning faith in religious leaders and the ease with which evil may pass for legitimacy. Realizing that outward appearances could conceal the most sinister intent, communities across the frontier started to doubt their preconceptions of both strangers and neighbors. The court trials also set significant standards for the protection of cooperating witnesses and the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases. Mercy Hardin's testimony opened the door for similar prosecutions in other intricate criminal cases by showing that familial loyalty could be overcome with the right incentives and legal protections. In 1801, a court decree sealed the case's remaining records, limiting access to only legal scholars and law enforcement officers. In addition to safeguarding the privacy of the victims' families, this decision was taken to stop other deranged people from using the Hardin's tactics as a model for their own homicidal aspirations. Only pieces of the Hardin family's history survived in regional mythology and familial customs, with the whole truth about them concealed in those sealed records for almost 200 years. The few historians who were allowed access to the data had to sign confidentiality agreements that forbade them from sharing information with other researchers or publicizing their results. The specifics of the killings were eventually forgotten, even by local memory, and the story became hazy recollections of bad folks who had once resided along Beaver Creek. As property lines shifted and new settlers arrived who were unaware of the region's troubled past, the actual location of the farm became ambiguous. Only a few of old locals could correctly identify the location of the Hardin homestead by the middle of the 1800s. Historians were finally able to piece together the full narrative of Kentucky's first family of serial killers in 1987 when the case files were reopened. However, there are still a lot of unsolved questions. Authorities think more remains might still be concealed in the darkest corridors that were too hazardous for investigators in the 18th century to reach, and the cave system where the family dumped their victims has never been thoroughly investigated. The subterranean caves would be very costly and difficult to explore, but modern forensic technology might be able to uncover much more about the family's crimes. Instead of risking fresh findings that could traumatize the victim's heirs, local authorities have showed little interest in addressing what they view as a historical matter, preferring to let the deceased lay in peace. Most unsettling of all, the Hardin case has compelled historians to reevaluate other strange disappearances that occurred along early American frontier highways. How many other decent families might have had comparable secrets to conceal? How many missing passengers were killed by well-thought-out murders committed by people they trusted, rather than by sporadic acts of violence, natural disasters, or Indian attacks? Unsettling trends in the statistical study of frontier disappearances imply that the Hardin family may not have been the only one. In the same time frame, clusters of disappearances have been found close to other wealthy philanthropic families in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Although systematic murder has not been directly connected to any of these incidents, there are enough striking parallels to merit additional research. The questions themselves serve as a terrifying reminder that evil frequently assumes the most innocent appearance, but the answers to these questions perished with Ezekiel Hardin on that August morning in 1799. Those who think they were carrying out God's will have often committed the worst atrocities in human history, and the frontier age of American expansion provided innumerable opportunity for such depraved people to act with impunity. The Hardin case also demonstrates the susceptibility of remote communities that prioritize trust over vigilance and reputation over proof. In addition to their own criminal prowess, the family's success hinged on their neighbors' readiness to ignore unsettling information in order to preserve social harmony. That willingness came at a cost in human lives. This riddle demonstrates that early American frontier justice was frequently more nuanced and unsettling than conventional histories have recognized. Predators who knew how to take advantage of the confidence and desperation of unsuspecting travelers found the westward expansion to be ideal hunting grounds, in addition to providing possibilities for law-abiding settlers looking to start over. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think that all of the crimes committed by the Hardin family have been made public? Or are there still more sinister truths hidden beneath the Kentucky soil? Were such families able to function in other frontier areas without ever being caught? Share your thoughts on this case in the comments section below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you liked this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. I'll see you in the upcoming video.